This is my true story. I was a husband, a father, a man who believed that family was sacred. My daughter's husband treated me like his own father. Polite, respectful, always eager to help. I thought I was lucky, but one evening changed everything. After a simple family dinner, he offered to drive me home. It was supposed to be a kind gesture. Yet halfway through the ride, I saw something that froze my blood. My wife's necklace, hanging from his mirror. The truth was right in front of me. But I didn't yell. I planned. Before I continue, please tell me where you're watching from and what time it is right now. And subscribe so my story can reach more people. It was one of those evenings that felt comforting from the start. The house was full. Laughter, clinking plates, the faint scent of roasted vegetables filling the air. He sat at the end of the table, watching his daughter smile beside her husband. They looked happy, content, and that warmed him more than the food ever could. His wife had cooked, humming as she moved between the kitchen and dining room. It felt like old times. Family gathered, stories shared, hearts unguarded. Nothing seemed wrong, nothing at all. His son-in-law, Mark, was everything a father could wish for in a man who'd married his daughter. Attentive, respectful, even overly courteous. He always made sure chairs were pulled out, plates cleared, drinks topped up. When he spoke, his words came smooth and thoughtful, like someone who understood charm well enough to use it as armor. The father often thought, "She's lucky to have him." He believed that because love, even borrowed love, feels real when you want it to. After dinner, his wife insisted on staying back with their daughter to clean. "You two go ahead," she'd said, with that familiar smile, the kind that meant both affection and authority. His son-in-law immediately offered to drive him home. "It's late," he'd said, "and the roads aren't safe for you to walk alone." It was true. His knees weren't what they used to be, and he appreciated the offer. They stepped outside, the cool night air washing over them. The driveway gleamed faintly under the porch light. The younger man opened the car door for him, still polite as ever, then walked around to the driver's side. It was a gesture so simple, so ordinary, that it didn't demand attention. But looking back, it was the first sign. The calm before the storm that would soon tear his world in two. The father settled into the passenger seat. The car smelled faintly of new leather, expensive cologne, and something else. A fragrance he hadn't noticed in years. Warm, floral, unmistakably familiar. His wife's perfume. He blinked, brushing it off as coincidence. Maybe she'd borrowed it once. Maybe his mind was playing tricks again. They drove off, headlights slicing through the stillness of the night. The hum of the engine filled the silence. They spoke of small things. His daughter's work, a new project at the office, weather, traffic. Nothing unusual, nothing suspicious. But beneath every word, something uneasy stirred. As they turned down the narrow lane toward his house, the old man shifted slightly, glancing toward the dashboard. That's when he saw it, a faint shimmer under the dim glow of the streetlight. Hanging from the rearview mirror was a delicate gold chain, swinging gently with each bump in the road. At first, he thought nothing of it. But then the car hit a turn, and the chain caught the light just right. His breath caught in his throat. He knew that design. The broken clasp, the tiny heart-shaped pendant with a small diamond chip. It wasn't just any necklace. It was her necklace, his wife's. His pulse began to race. Weeks ago, she had told him she'd lost it. Somewhere in the garden, maybe at the market. He remembered comforting her, saying it was only jewelry, not realizing that moment had been a rehearsal for betrayal. He turned his face to the window, the cool glass pressing against his temple, hiding the tremor that had taken over his hands. His son-in-law kept driving, unaware or pretending to be. The old man's chest tightened, not with anger, but with clarity. Everything that hadn't made sense before now did. The late-night calls his wife claimed were from her sister, the sudden trips to visit old friends, the laughter that didn't sound like guilt. It all fell into place like shards forming a single, sharp mirror. As they pulled into the driveway, the son-in-law smiled and said goodnight. His tone was warm, his eyes steady. The father nodded back, forcing a faint smile. he didn't speak. He couldn't. Every word would have cracked open what little strength he had left. When the car disappeared down the street, he stood there in silence, feeling the night close around him. The necklace's image lingered in his mind, gold against black, betrayal against loyalty. He walked slowly to the door, each step heavy, deliberate. He didn't know what he would do yet, but he knew one thing for certain. Whatever happened next would be quiet, careful, and absolute. He opened the door, stepped inside, and for the first time in his life, felt like a stranger in his own home. The car door closed with a soft click, sealing him into the faint hum of the engine and the smell of polished interiors. It was the kind of car that spoke of success, the expensive leather, the subtle air freshener, the smooth, controlled sound of the motor. His son-in-law drove with casual confidence, one hand on the wheel, the other resting comfortably, as if life itself had no weight. The old man stared out at the quiet streetlights flashing past the windows, unaware that this ordinary drive would rewrite the meaning of family in his heart. They started with small talk, the kind that fills silence without touching anything real. The younger man spoke about work, about how busy he'd been, about how stressful life had become since taking over new responsibilities. The father listened, nodding now and then, not really caring about the words, just proud that his daughter had chosen a man who sounded steady and hard-working. He remembered how years ago he'd welcomed him into the family with open arms, offering advice, a roof, even money when the couple struggled. To him, that night's car ride was another small moment of connection, a father-in-law and son-in-law bound by shared respect. But something shifted when a faint scent filled the air. It wasn't the car's fragrance, nor the usual leather and aftershave. It was something delicate, personal, hauntingly familiar. His wife's perfume. A scent that hadn't faded from his memory in decades, the kind that clung softly to her skin and scarves. He froze for a second, unsure whether his mind was playing tricks on him. The car windows were closed. The smell was faint but unmistakable. He glanced around subtly, his eyes moving from the dashboard to the back seat. Everything seemed spotless, almost too clean, except for one small thing. Hanging from the rearview mirror was a chain, thin and gold, catching glimmers of light with every bump on the road. At first, it was just another trinket, but when the car turned under the streetlight, the glint grew sharper, clearer, and his heart stuttered. The pendant, the broken clasp, the tiny dent near the curve of the heart. He knew it instantly. It was his wife's necklace. Weeks earlier, she had told him she'd misplaced it, probably left it at her friend's house or dropped it in the garden. He remembered helping her search drawers and cushions, watching her act frustrated yet oddly calm. He had believed her, of course he had. They'd been married for over 40 years. Lies didn't belong in that kind of marriage, or so he thought. Now, sitting in that car, he realized how wrong he'd been. The chain swung lightly as they hit another turn. His chest tightened. Each sway of that gold pendant felt like a whisper of betrayal. His hands rested on his lap, trembling slightly. He looked out the window again, pretending to admire the passing houses. He didn't want the younger man to notice the storm building inside him. A strange calm settled over him, the kind of calm that comes when truth arrives, uninvited. Every small detail from the past weeks began aligning. The late-night phone calls his wife brushed off, the secretive smiles exchanged during family dinners, the soft tension in the air whenever his daughter's husband came over. None of it had made sense before. Now, everything did. The younger man kept talking, unaware of the silent war in the passenger seat. His tone carried pride, a bit of arrogance, the same arrogance that had started appearing lately, disguised as confidence. The father studied him quietly, watching the smoothness of his expression, the ease of his hands, the self-assuredness of someone who thought he could hide anything. When they reached his house, the younger man pulled over and smiled politely, wishing him a good night. The old man nodded slowly, forcing gratitude through clenched teeth. His eyes flicked once more toward the mirror, toward that glimmer of gold swaying gently under the dim cabin light. He stepped out without a word. The night air hit him cold and sharp. As the car reversed out of the driveway, its taillights vanished into the dark, leaving silence behind. He stood there for a long while before entering the house. His mind replayed every sound, every flicker of that necklace, every second of that ride. Something deep inside him broke, not loudly, but like glass cracking under slow pressure. He had seen betrayal before in life, but never this close, never this cruelly intimate. He walked inside, set his cane beside the door, and sat down in the dark. The world outside continued quietly, as if nothing had changed, but inside him something had, something final. He didn't yet know how he'd confront it, or when, but he knew one thing clearly. The truth no longer needed proof. It had already hung from that mirror, gleaming in the dark like a confession. The drive home had ended, but the echoes of that moment refused to fade. The image of the necklace swaying in the car haunted him. Every time he blinked, he saw it again. That delicate golden chain glimmering under the dull light, mocking him with its quiet truth. For years, he had believed his life was simple, stable, built on decades of love and family trust. But as he sat alone in his dimly lit living room, everything he thought he knew began to unravel, thread by thread. His heart beat heavier with every memory that resurfaced. Small things, forgotten details, the way his wife's phone would light up late at night, her soft excuse of just a message from the girls, the quiet tension whenever his son-in-law dropped by alone, offering to help around the house, the subtle, knowing smiles exchanged between them at family gatherings, smiles he had once mistaken for kindness. Now, all those pieces fit together in a cruel design. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the family photographs on the wall. There they all were, smiling, perfect, untouched by truth. His wife's face shone in those frames, radiant and loving, the way he wanted to remember her. But behind those smiles was now a shadow he could never unsee. He wanted to tell himself he was overthinking, that grief or age had made him paranoid. But the necklace, that broken clasp, that unmistakable dent, it was proof more damning than any word. The sound of laughter drifted faintly from outside, pulling him out of his thoughts. It reminded him of the family they once were, holidays spent together, dinners filled with stories, warmth, and gratitude. But that laughter now felt hollow. The people he had built his world around had turned it into a stage where he was the fool. When morning came, he moved through the day like a ghost. His wife acted normal, humming while watering the plants, moving gracefully through the house as though nothing was wrong. Her calmness made him sick. Every small gesture looked rehearsed, every smile a lie. He found himself studying her more closely, her phone that never left her hand, the quick glances toward the driveway when a car passed. One evening, his daughter called to check in. She sounded cheerful, unaware of the storm that was brewing between her father and husband. Hearing her voice made him ache even more. The betrayal didn't just destroy a marriage, it poisoned the entire family. If he confronted his wife now, it wouldn't just break his heart, it would shatter his daughter's world. So he said nothing. Not yet. Instead, he replayed the drive in his head again and again. The faint smirk on his son-in-law's face, the confident tone, the easy comfort of a man who believed his secret was safe. That was what hurt most, not just the betrayal, but the arrogance of it. They thought they could outsmart an old man, hide love in plain sight, and walk away untouched. But the silence that settled inside him wasn't weakness. It was something else, something colder, sharper, and far more patient. He spent the night pacing between rooms, each step a slow realization that his home had turned into a stranger's house. The bed no longer felt like a place of rest. The photographs felt like lies trapped in glass. His wife's perfume, once his comfort, now made him feel sick. Every breath carried the scent of deceit. At one point, he walked out to the garden, the cool air brushing against his face, The night sky stretched endlessly, calm and indifferent. He looked up and whispered nothing, but his silence carried a decision. He wouldn't scream, he wouldn't accuse, he would let time and truth do the talking. People who betray always dig their own graves. All he needed to do was wait and be ready. When he came back inside, his wife had already gone to bed. Her phone sat charging on the table, blinking quietly. He stared at it for a long moment, not with anger, but with pity. Whatever she thought she'd found with that man would not last. Secrets never do. He turned off the light, went to his study, and opened his old ledger. It was time to start writing things down, not as revenge, but as record. Every call, every visit, every unexplained absence. If the truth had to come out, it would come with proof so undeniable that not even tears could wash it away. That night, as he closed the book and set his pen aside, he made himself a promise. He wouldn't confront them yet, not until the lies became too heavy for them to carry. And when that day came, he would not raise his voice. He would only raise the truth. That night, sleep refused to come. The house felt colder than usual, the silence pressing against him like a weight. He sat by the living room window, the glow of the streetlight faintly illuminating the walls lined with memories. Every corner of the room whispered a different story. The laughter that once echoed there, the dinners that ended in warmth, the mornings that began with coffee and calm conversation. Now, even the furniture seemed to watch him with pity. The betrayal he had uncovered wasn't loud or dramatic. It was quiet, almost elegant, the kind of deceit that hides behind familiar smiles. When he finally rose to go to bed, he saw the light still on in his wife's room. The door was slightly open, the sound of drawers moving inside. For a moment, he wondered if she was searching for the same necklace she had once claimed to lose. The thought made his stomach twist. He moved closer, quietly, not to spy, but to understand. Through the narrow gap, he saw her gently closing a box of jewelry, humming faintly. Calm, collected, perfectly at peace. The image burned into him. How could she be so composed when everything she wore and every word she spoke had turned into a lie? He retreated to his study instead. The smell of old books and paper steadied him. On his desk sat a glass of water, his spectacles, and a photo frame, a picture of his wife and daughter taken 20 years ago at a seaside trip. He remembered the laughter that day, how his wife's hair blew wildly in the wind while his daughter ran barefoot through the waves. That was the woman he'd grown old with, or at least the woman he thought he had. He ran his hand across the frame and whispered a silent prayer for clarity, not for revenge. But clarity comes with pain. When dawn began to break, he still hadn't closed his eyes. Instead, he had spent hours thinking, piecing together moments that once seemed meaningless. The late-night text tones, the excuses to visit the daughter's house even when the daughter was away, the subtle avoidance whenever he asked questions. He had once dismissed them as coincidence or insecurity. Now they stood before him as evidence. He wasn't a man built for confrontation. His whole life had been about patience, raising his daughter with discipline, caring for his wife with tenderness, and running his business with honesty. But patience, he realized, could be mistaken for blindness. And when people believe you cannot see, they grow bold enough to betray you in daylight. At sunrise, he brewed himself tea, the very ritual that once started every peaceful morning. But even that had changed. The cup trembled slightly in his hands. He looked at the steam curling upward, remembering how his wife used to prepare his tea. 1 spoon of sugar, a slice of lemon, a quiet smile. Today, he drank it bitter. The warmth did nothing to ease the chill in his chest. He walked to her room after breakfast. The bed was neatly made, the scent of her perfume still hanging faintly in the air. Her jewelry box sat on the dresser, polished and full, but one space remained empty, a small indentation where that gold necklace had once rested. That missing piece was no longer a mystery. He didn't need to ask her where it went. He already knew. He turned away, breathing slowly, carefully, as though every exhale might shatter the fragile calm he was forcing himself to keep. He could confront her, demand the truth, shout the accusations, spill everything, but shouting would only make him look weak, emotional, irrational. He didn't want to fight. He wanted exposure, clean, undeniable, final. That night, as the house grew quiet again, he sat alone at the dining table and began making notes. Names, dates, places, times, every pattern he could recall. He wasn't writing out of anger. He was documenting reality, building something solid out of the fog of deceit. He would collect the truth piece by piece until even lies would have nowhere to hide. When he finally stood up to go to bed, the house was still dark, his wife asleep down the hall. The only light came from the window, pale and cold, spilling over the pages he had written. He looked at them once more before blowing out the lamp. In those lines lay his resolve, quiet, merciful, and unshakable. He wasn't just preparing to expose a betrayal. He was preparing to reclaim his peace. The days that followed were a test of endurance. Every smile from his wife felt like a dagger wrapped in silk. Every good morning sounded like a carefully rehearsed line from a play she no longer believed in. He moved through the house slowly, not as a husband anymore, but as a quiet observer collecting fragments of truth. Betrayal had made him sharp, not cruel, but focused. His hands shook less now, his mind clear as glass. He was no longer blinded by heartbreak. He was guided by purpose. He began to watch closely, not out of obsession, but necessity. He noticed that she left the house every Thursday afternoon, always dressed carefully, always saying she was meeting old friends. On those evenings, she returned with the faint scent of cologne that wasn't hers, and a strange softness in her eyes, as if she were coming home from somewhere far warmer than honesty. The son-in-law's car would occasionally be parked down the street near the cafe, not near his daughter's house, but within walking distance from his own. Coincidence, perhaps, but coincidences had already betrayed him once. One evening, when she stepped out as usual, he quietly opened the drawer in the hallway where she kept her keys and found the spare to the back gate missing. That small gap in the ring told him more than words ever could. In his study sat an old security camera system he'd installed years ago, back when safety still meant something. The small monitor had gathered dust, forgotten, but the wires were still intact. He spent half the night reconnecting it, his hands trembling as he worked. The screen flickered to life, showing the grainy view of the back garden, the gate, the fence, the old path that led to the street. He repositioned the angle slightly, then sat back, waiting. For 3 nights, nothing happened. He started to wonder if grief had made him paranoid, if the necklace and the strange perfume were only signs of loneliness twisting his mind. But on the 4th night, just after 11, he saw it. The gate opened softly. A figure stepped through, his wife, cloaked in the familiar outline of her favorite shawl. Her movements were cautious, not nervous, but practiced. Moments later, headlights glowed faintly in the corner of the screen. A car door opened. She slipped inside without hesitation. The taillights vanished down the road. He didn't move for a long time. The silence in the house pressed harder than ever, heavy with the confirmation he'd dreaded. The truth, now seen with his own eyes, carried more weight than anger could hold. He didn't feel fury, only a deep, hollow ache. The kind that comes when love dies quietly instead of being taken. The next morning, he downloaded the footage and saved it to a small flash drive, labeling it with nothing but a single word: proof. He watched her as she served breakfast, smiling, humming, unaware that the foundation of deceit beneath her was starting to crumble. He responded kindly, asking about her plans for the day. The act of calmness became his shield, the appearance of peace, his greatest weapon. Over the next week, he gathered more evidence. Phone records from the shared family account showed frequent late-night calls between her number and his son-in-law's. The timestamps matched the same nights she'd been meeting friends. Receipts in her purse showed dinners for 2, paid in cash. He photographed everything, stored it carefully, and locked it away. He wasn't preparing for confrontation, He was building truth in layers. Each piece of proof wasn't for vengeance. It was for clarity. He didn't want shouting matches or tears or apologies rehearsed too late. He wanted facts to speak for him when the time came, because truth spoken by paper and picture leaves no room for denial. One evening, as she left again, he stood at the window and watched her walk down the street, unaware of the eyes that no longer looked at her with love. He realized something important. Forgiveness and revenge aren't opposites. Sometimes they wear the same face, the calm expression of a man who has finally stopped pretending. That night, he placed all the evidence in a folder, slid it into his briefcase, and locked it. Tomorrow, he would visit his lawyer. Tomorrow, silence would end. The necklace had started it. The truth would finish it. The morning he met his lawyer, the air felt strangely lighter, as if the house itself knew something was about to change. The man who once walked with doubt now carried quiet precision. He had already arranged everything. The folder of evidence, the backup copies, and the will revisions written neatly in his briefcase. He wasn't just preparing to expose betrayal. He was preparing to rebuild the balance that deceit had destroyed. His lawyer, an old family friend, looked at him with both surprise and respect. He had known the man for decades, honest, patient, never vengeful. Now he was different, calm, deliberate, and painfully clear about what he wanted. Together they reviewed the photos, the call records, and the footage from the security camera. The evidence spoke for itself. No words were needed. The lawyer took a deep breath and said quietly, "This is enough." That confirmation didn't bring him joy, only stillness. He didn't feel like a victor. He felt like a man walking through the ashes of something once sacred. But still, he continued. He authorized his lawyer to begin drafting changes to his estate. The family business, once shared with his son-in-law, would now be pulled out of their control entirely. The house would be transferred under his sole ownership. Accounts, shares, insurance policies, all restructured quietly, all sealed before anyone could sense a shift. Each signature was a small act of justice. He returned home that afternoon with no visible emotion. His wife greeted him with her usual grace, asking about his day, smiling as if their life hadn't already begun to crumble beneath her feet. He responded kindly, playing his part. The act of normalcy became a shield behind which his plan grew stronger. He spent the evening as if nothing was amiss, reading the paper, watching television, pouring tea. Yet beneath that silence, the foundations of betrayal were being dismantled brick by brick. That night, he sat at his desk again and wrote one more letter. Not to his wife, not to his daughter, but to himself. In it, he wrote the words he could never say aloud. "You are not weak for staying calm. You are strong for waiting until the truth cannot hide." It wasn't anger that fueled him now. It was clarity. Over the next few days, he finalized everything. He contacted the company's board discreetly, arranging a meeting under the pretext of restructuring management. His lawyer helped him quietly remove his son-in-law from all business authorizations. Each action was silent but decisive. The papers were filed, the changes approved, the signatures notarized. By the time the weekend arrived, the man his wife and son-in-law thought they had deceived was already 3 steps ahead. They had no idea that the business they profited from, the home they felt entitled to, and the comfort they took for granted now belonged solely to him. The final part of his plan wasn't legal. It was human. He wanted the truth to reveal itself in daylight, not behind court doors. For that, he would need a moment that neither of them could run from, lie through, or deny. A single moment of exposure, quiet, public, and irreversible. He chose Sunday lunch. It was the one day when his daughter and her husband always came by. A family tradition that had continued for years. It was perfect. The day meant for togetherness would instead become the day truth reclaimed its seat at the table. He spent the Saturday before preparing like he always did. Cooked their favorite dish, set the table neatly, and even placed fresh flowers in the center, the same kind his wife loved. Every detail looked peaceful. every gesture warm. To anyone watching, it would seem like a normal weekend in a happy home. But beneath that peace, he had already sealed everything. The lawyer's letters, the proof, the revised will. They were all neatly arranged in a plain brown envelope, labeled in simple handwriting, "For my family's honesty." That envelope would end the illusion, not with shouting, not with accusations, but with evidence so pure that even lies would fall silent. When he looked in the mirror that night, he didn't see an old, broken man anymore. He saw someone steady, tired, yes, but free. Tomorrow, the truth would sit at his table, and it would finally be served warm. Sunday arrived, dressed in quiet deceit. The house smelled of freshly baked bread and slow-cooked stew, the kind of warmth that used to mean comfort. His daughter arrived first, her laughter echoing through the hallway as she called out greetings. Behind her followed her husband, confident as ever, his smile rehearsed and charming. And then came his wife, graceful and composed, as though her heart hadn't already been weighed down by secrets. They all gathered around the table, unaware that every plate, every folded napkin, and every glance from the old man was part of something final. He played the role perfectly, asked about their week, complimented his wife's new dress, even poured wine into their glasses, his hand steady. No one suspected anything. To them, it was just another Sunday, another family lunch, another illusion of love. But for him, it was the stage where truth would finally breathe. The meal began softly. Conversations about work, small jokes, shallow laughter, all masks worn over quiet guilt. He looked at his daughter and felt his heart twist. She didn't deserve this. She was the only innocent one at the table, still believing her family was whole. That made the coming moment harder. But some truths, he knew, must be seen, even if they hurt. Halfway through the meal, when the laughter had just begun to sound natural again, he reached into his coat pocket and placed a brown envelope on the table. Its sound against the wood silenced the room instantly. No words were spoken. The daughter's smile faded. His wife's hand froze midair. The son-in-law looked at it curiously, unaware that inside those few sheets of paper lay the end of everything he had built through deceit. The old man spoke softly, his tone gentle, not angry, not loud, just steady. "For my family's honesty." That was all he said. No one moved for several seconds. Finally, the son-in-law reached out, tearing the seal with shaky hands. Inside were photographs first, blurry images printed in grayscale. One showed a car parked outside the house at night. Another, a woman stepping out from the gate. Another, two figures embracing in the dim glow of the streetlight. His wife gasped quietly, the color draining from her face. The son-in-law's eyes widened, darting between her and the photos, his confidence collapsing into panic. Then came the next set of papers, call logs, timestamps, and copies of bank transactions linking their secret meetings and expenses. Each page told the same story, layer after layer of betrayal, recorded and undeniable. His daughter's voice trembled as she whispered a single word. "Mum?" But her mother couldn't look at her. Shame had a way of shrinking people, of taking away not just pride, but speech. The room, once filled with warmth, was now a courtroom of silence. The old man sat back, watching them quietly. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't point fingers. He let the evidence speak for him. His calmness made the truth even sharper. He looked at his wife once, not with hatred, but with sorrow so deep it looked like forgiveness. Then his eyes turned to his son-in-law, the man who had once called him Dad. There was no rage there, only finality. When the last paper was pulled from the envelope, it wasn't evidence. It was consequence. Two documents lay side by side. One, a divorce agreement already signed by him and stamped by his lawyer. The other, an official termination letter removing his son-in-law from his company and nullifying his ownership shares. The son-in-law's mouth opened as if to argue, but no sound came. His wife covered her face, trembling, her composure gone. The daughter sat still, her world collapsing quietly around her. The old man stood up slowly, his movements deliberate. He didn't gloat. He didn't speak again. He simply placed his napkin on the table, turned toward the window, and breathed deeply. The garden outside looked peaceful, honest, a stark contrast to the wreckage sitting behind him. As he left the room, the last thing they heard was the soft click of the door closing. No slamming, no shouting, no drama, just an ending written with silence and truth. That day, he didn't lose his family. He revealed what was never real, and in that revelation, he found something purer than revenge: clarity. The hours after the confrontation stretched into silence. The air in the house felt different, lighter, yet hollow, as if the walls themselves were exhaling years of deceit. He sat in his study, hearing muffled voices from the dining room. His daughter's sobs, his wife's weak apologies, and the low murmurs of confusion mixed like a storm he no longer wished to calm. He didn't interrupt. He didn't comfort. He had done enough of that in a lifetime where he gave and they took. Tonight, he simply existed, not as a husband or father, but as the man who had finally unmasked the truth. When he returned to the dining room, his wife and son-in-law were gone. Only his daughter remained, sitting in silence, staring at the papers still on the table. The food had gone cold, untouched. She looked up at him with tear-streaked eyes, and though no words were spoken, her face carried the question that shattered him. "How long have you known?" He gave her a soft look, not of blame, but of sorrow, then gently placed his hand on her shoulder. "Long enough," he whispered in his heart, though the words never left his lips. She didn't need to hear them. She already knew. The next morning, news spread quietly. The son-in-law's sudden dismissal from the company raised eyebrows, and soon whispers began to circulate. Whispers that turned into stories, stories that turned into shame. The man who once strutted through the office as if he owned it now walked with lowered eyes. The staff avoided him. The board refused his calls, and his reputation crumbled faster than he could defend it. His wife tried reaching out several times, but each message went unanswered. The old man had no more explanations left to give, no more forgiveness to offer. She had spent her loyalty elsewhere. She could keep her apologies there too. The divorce process moved quickly. His lawyer handled everything with the same precision he had used to build his plan. Every asset was separated cleanly, every lie cut out like a tumor. When the final papers were signed, the house no longer felt haunted. It was his again, not a home filled with deception, but a place of peace reclaimed through pain. Days turned into weeks, and for the first time in decades, he found stillness in solitude. The mornings were quiet. He brewed his tea, read his paper, and listened to the faint sounds of birds outside. No longer did he hear whispers behind doors or lies disguised as laughter. It wasn't happiness he felt, not yet, but something purer, relief. The outside world, however, hadn't forgotten. The story eventually reached the local paper. "Businessman ends marriage and partnership after family scandal." It wasn't a sensational headline, but it was enough. The world didn't need to know every detail. They just needed to see that deceit had consequences. His daughter visited often, always quiet, always gentle. She was caught between love and disappointment, but she never judged him. Instead, she began to understand that sometimes silence isn't cruelty. It's the only language left when truth has spoken too loudly. He comforted her as best he could, assuring her that none of this was her fault. He wanted her to remember that even broken families can grow new roots, just not always in the same soil. One evening, she brought his granddaughter along. The child ran through the garden laughing, unaware of the storm that had once lived there. Watching her, the old man realized that perhaps some innocence still survived, that maybe, just maybe, the next generation could be built on honesty instead of deception. That night, he sat in his chair by the window, looking out at the stars. He thought about everything that had fallen apart, and everything he had rebuilt in silence. The house no longer echoed with false warmth. It breathed truth instead. When he finally closed his eyes, he understood something simple but profound. Some endings don't need applause or witnesses. They just need peace. The next morning, he packed away the last remnants of that chapter, the photos, the wedding ring, the documents, and placed them neatly in a box labeled "Closed." For the first time in years, he truly meant it. In the weeks that followed, calm replaced chaos. The storm that had once consumed his home had finally passed, leaving behind only still air and silence. But this silence was not empty. It was sacred. It was the kind that heals, the kind that lets old wounds breathe. He spent his mornings differently now, no longer waiting for voices or footsteps, but for sunlight creeping through the curtains and the gentle sound of the sea outside his new window. He had sold the house, the one that had seen too much deceit, too many hollow smiles. Letting it go wasn't loss, it was freedom. The very walls that once held secrets now belonged to strangers, and that felt right. He didn't need that house anymore. He needed peace, and peace rarely lives in the same place as betrayal. His new home was a small cottage by the coast. It wasn't grand, but it was honest. The air smelled of salt and damp earth, and gulls cried softly above the cliffs. Here, the noise of the world couldn't reach him. The only sounds were natural. Waves folding against the rocks, the wind brushing through the curtains, and the steady rhythm of his own breathing. He no longer carried the weight of pretending. Each morning, he brewed his tea and sat on the porch overlooking the sea. He watched fishermen in the distance and children playing on the sand, their laughter pure and unfiltered, something he had long forgotten the sound of. He smiled to himself, realizing that peace wasn't found in revenge or victory, but in the quiet satisfaction of knowing the truth had been set free. His days settled into a rhythm, reading, writing letters, tending to a small garden he'd planted behind the cottage. There were no phone calls, no arguments, no performances, just solitude, but the kind that healed rather than hurt. The garden became his new companion. He grew roses and lavender, plants that demanded patience and rewarded it. Every time a bud opened, he saw proof that time can bloom even after pain. He had also transferred part of his old business shares, not to his daughter or her husband, but directly to his granddaughter. He didn't want the next generation burdened by the sins of the last. The funds were locked in a trust for her education and future. It was his quiet way of rewriting the family legacy, one free from lies, one born out of redemption instead of inheritance. Sometimes his daughter visited, often with her little girl. They would sit on the porch together, watching the sunset. She had changed since that day, softer, quieter, but stronger too. Though the bond between them had been fractured, it hadn't broken. There were moments of awkward silence between them, but those silences were honest. They both knew that love could survive truth, even when it couldn't survive illusion. His wife never returned. She had chosen her path, and he had chosen peace. He no longer checked for letters or messages from her. The closure had come the day he watched her leave without looking back. He didn't hate her. Hate would have chained him to her forever. Instead, he forgave her, not for her sake, but for his own. Forgiveness was the final act of liberation. Evenings in the cottage were his favorite. He would light a small lamp, open the window, and let the cool sea breeze drift in. The light shimmered across the pages of the book he was reading, and for the first time in years, his mind wasn't haunted by what-ifs. He had made peace with every chapter of his life, even the painful ones. Sometimes he thought about that dinner table, the envelope, the silence, the moment of truth. He realized that was the day his life had truly begun again. It wasn't revenge that saved him. It was courage. The courage to walk away from what poisoned him. And as the waves crashed softly against the rocks outside, he would smile faintly and whisper to himself, "Some endings are quieter than others, but they echo longer." Now, as the years folded into one another like quiet pages of an old book, he often found himself sitting on that same porch, watching the sun dissolve into the sea. The waves came and went, just as people once had, some gentle, some cruel, but all leaving marks on the shore of his memory. Time had done what revenge never could. It softened him. He no longer carried the sharpness of anger, nor the ache of betrayal. What remained was understanding, calm, clean, and heavy with truth. He often thought back to that night at the table, the envelope resting between hands that once held love. He remembered the silence that followed, the kind of silence that could end generations. But when he replayed it now, he didn't feel bitterness. He felt release. The truth had cost him a family, yes, but it had given him something rarer, the chance to live the rest of his life unburdened by lies. Sometimes his neighbors visited, people from the village who saw him as just another kind old man by the sea. They didn't know his story. They didn't know that behind the wrinkles on his face were scars carved by trust misplaced. But when they asked about family, he simply smiled. "They're somewhere," he would say softly, "and I hope they found peace too." It wasn't sarcasm. It was genuine. The years had taught him that forgiveness wasn't approval, it was freedom. He had stopped counting who stayed and who left. The daughter, who visited occasionally, brought updates about her life and her little girl. The granddaughter, who had unknowingly inherited not money, but a cleaner legacy. Watching her grow had become his quiet redemption. She didn't need to know the full story. She only needed to see what truth looked like when carried with dignity. He kept one photo framed by his bedside, not of his wife or his son-in-law, but of his younger self, standing proudly beside the old family home. It reminded him that before betrayal, before heartbreak, there was still a man who had loved purely, who had worked honestly, and who had believed in the good in others. That man hadn't died through betrayal. He had simply changed form. He had become wiser, quieter, and less trusting, but never bitter. The cottage by the sea became more than a home. It became a metaphor. It stood firm against the wind, weathered but standing. Its cracks didn't weaken it. They told its story. He saw himself in it. A man once broken by deceit, now built stronger by solitude. Some evenings he wrote letters, not to send, but to clear his thoughts. He wrote to his wife, to his daughter, even to the son-in-law who had betrayed him. In those letters, there was no anger left, only reflection. "We all lose ourselves," one letter read, "but the tragedy is when we never find the way back." Writing them was never about closure. It was about peace. He often reflected that betrayal, at its core, wasn't about the act itself. It was about the illusion it destroyed. Once that illusion was gone, the truth was painful, but purifying. He had lived long enough to see that pain could either harden a man or hollow him out for light to enter. He chose the latter. On the anniversary of that fateful dinner, he brewed tea, the same kind he once shared with the family he'd lost. He raised his cup quietly to the sea and whispered, "Thank you." Not for what they'd done, but for what it had taught him: patience, strength, and the wisdom to let go. He leaned back in his chair, eyes half closed, and smiled faintly. "I didn't lose a wife," he thought. "I lost an illusion." The line had become his truth. Simple, quiet, absolute. The wind carried the scent of salt and lavender through the air, brushing against his face like an old friend. And in that stillness, he realized the final lesson of his life. Peace isn't something found. It's something made, one honest moment at a time. Final thought. He gave me a ride home with her necklace hanging. I let truth drive them both away. And in the quiet that followed, I finally arrived where I was meant to be, home.